Hey, this is Ramon, Channels Alpha 4, and I injured my neck on a pool, uh, actually more the trap. And so I have a day off, so I decided to reread Hesiod, uh, Theogony and Working Days, specifically Working Days. And if you're wondering about the sound quality, my mic shut the bed. It's done. So I gotta get a new one. Quit working on it. Anyway, uh, I'd like to talk about working days. So, if you're not familiar with Hesiod, he's part of the three main uh, books of Greek mythology, which would be the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Theogony. But another very important book, and I use the word book here loosely, is Working Days. And Working Days is basically an almanac, farmer's almanac, but it's also like real world advice. Think of you know some of the light philosophy advice of the early American colonists. So like it's really good stuff here. It talks a little bit about the gods and about how to properly worship them. It talks about uh, how to treat your friends like friends, your enemies like enemies. It talks about how to know right before it's going to rain, when to plant, when not to plant. It tells you how to build a cart, how big a cart should be. A lot of little useful, helpful advice for farming. And surprisingly, until you get to the very end, a lot of the advice is actually practical and still useful today. You could probably follow this and have a successful small garden. Uh, it only starts getting a little crazy when it starts getting about what days are holy days and what days are good for a specific person. But before that, it's actually really good advice. I first read this, specifically this copy from Oxford World Classics, back when I was like maybe 19 or 20. And I remember really being into the mythology and really liking to explore the origin of the gods and the actual Greek version of these stories, because we're all familiar with the Roman. Uh, the Greek is quite interesting and quite deep, and it gets very metaphysical, quite literally. And that's where I left it. I just took it as mythology. And then when I reread it a few years later, right after I graduated college, I read the uh, Gutenberg version online. And I think back then it was the Perseus Project. And when I reread it, I was actually doing some gardening at the time, and I used some of its advice for planting some strawberries and planting some grapevines and stuff like that, just as kind of like just to see if it would work. And surprisingly enough, it did. But rereading it today, and it's actually really good advice for how to treat people. Unfortunately, there is some misogyny in here. Like, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to be like, oh, it's perfectly fair to women. No, it's pretty fair to men, but it doesn't exactly treat women with respect. Um, that being said, it's a letter in a way from Hesiod to his brother Persis or Precis, and I don't know exactly what the story of that is, but it seems like uh, his younger brother got the land instead of him because he was off uh, going to funeral games, or one funeral game in particular, to win a prize for poetry for reciting his stories of the gods. So this would take place somewhere in the 750s BC. I'm not really sure if this would be, in actuality, if this guy was real, which is a whole other thing. But if this guy was real, I'm not sure if this would be taking place in around the time of the Trojan War, after the Trojan War, or long after the Trojan War. So we're talking about anywhere from 1100 BC to 700 BC is really the time frame that these stories could have been composed. and when they were transposed and put into written language, who knows how much later. Um, the story is really good. The flow is really good. It's really nice. If you like the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, you'll like this. I mean, it flows that easy and that smooth. There are other books that even modern literature that is not as smooth as this writing. And it's not just this translation. For instance, this time around, I didn't read this translation. I actually read, or I was co-reading a translation from my Kindle, and that one was really good. I don't know who the publisher is for that one, and it was interesting to now have read three different translations of this work. I'd highly recommend it. It's really good to learn the mythology of the actual Greeks. And like I said, this is right before the polis really becomes a thing in Greece. So you're getting a little bit of Dark Age Greek mythology, but you're getting basically what will become the foundations of the mythology in the polis, well before Plato and Socrates and all those guys come in and start tearing down the ideas of organized or disorganized religion. It's really interesting. It's really neat. I highly recommend it. Go pick up your copy of Hesiod, Theogony in Working Days today. Peace.